Okay, I'm just going to briefly cover the chapter on objections to hedonism. So, in that chapter, you saw there are four different ones I raised here. I'm going to cover the first and the fourth in this short little mini lecture. Um, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about an interesting disagreement between Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Okay, so the first one is this idea of lobotomizing one's child. If you don't know what a lobotomy is, it has to do with removing parts of the frontal lobe, which have to, the frontal lobe accounts for our kind of most of our characteristically human capacities. Human beings have, relative to our closest ancestors, much larger brains in general, but also in particular their frontal lobes. Um, so sometimes lobotomies were done for reasons like if someone had, like really bad like seizures or something, or some other thing that really interfered with their life, that then you could remove part of the frontal lobe. And uh, I mean, it's a big cost, right, for big side effect for treating whatever problem. But the idea of a lobotomy, right, is that you're, in the way that Philippa Foot talks about it, is that you're kind of you're turning a human being into something that doesn't have the same kinds of cognitive capacities as normally developed human beings do, right? And the idea behind the objection is that, well, the idea behind Philippa Foot's kind of notion of why would you lobotomize your child is just this idea that very often people with, let's just say, simpler minds, less cognitive capacity, are often happier. With increased kind of brain power often comes increased kind of stresses and um, unhappiness. So so here's the setup. Suppose that you could be guaranteed that by lobotomizing your child, they would be happier, right? They would live a happier life. A simpler life, yes, but also a happier life on the whole, if we're just kind of summing up quantities of attitudinal pleasure, right? So suppose that, you could make your child happier on whole by removing part of their frontal lobe, and thus, you know, making them less uh, uh, cognitively capable. So, why is this an objection? Well, pretty clearly, I think if we were to take a poll right now, and we ask, would you lobotomize your child if it could be guaranteed to make them happy? And I think that probably most people would say, heck no, I wouldn't do that. Um, and the fact that we say absolutely not shows that happiness isn't the only thing that matters to us when we think about what it means to live well for a human being, right? What is human well-being? Um, because of course, if the hedonist is right, then and happiness is the only thing that matters, right? No matter what the quality of that happiness is, right? If, for example, you could be as happy as you could possibly be, just counting blades of grass all day, and that's all it took for you to just have the highest level of happiness. Most human beings are such that that would not make them happy. But suppose that, by performing this lobotomy, you could make your child totally happy simply by counting blades of grass all day long, every day, right? Um, so again, the idea is that, you know, the fact that we wouldn't lobotomize our child, even if it could be guaranteed to, lead to increased happiness over their lifetime, shows that happiness isn't the only thing that we think matters for human well-being. Another objection, the last one I talk about in the chapter, is this idea of a trajectory of your life. So imagine, for the hedonist, what the theory implies that, your life goes well to the extent that you attain happiness, attitudinal pleasure throughout your life, right? So we can imagine, however, two very different ways that two lives might contain the same amount of happiness. One would be that if the person, when they start, their life, their happiness is very low. So maybe they're born into really bad circumstances. They don't have their family doesn't have much money. Maybe their parents are even abusive. But throughout, the twists and turns of fate, they're able to kind of pull themselves up by their bootstraps and turn their life around until at the end of their life, their happiness is at as high as it could possibly be. So their life kind of goes better and better for them as they live, right? Let's call that person person B. And person A, their life has the kind of opposite trajectory. They start out as happy as you could possibly be, with everything you could want in life. And again, through the twists and turns of fate, their life becomes kind of worse and worse over the course of their life, until at the point when they die, when they're old, they are kind of alone and living on the street without any friends or family, without any basic comforts, and they're just really miserable. Now, if you think about summing the pleasure over the two lives of these individuals, as you can see on the graph here, it seems that just mathematically, the pleasure over the whole of their life is going to come out to be the same, which would mean, for the hedonist, if we're thinking about, how well your life goes as a kind of sum of the pleasure, then it looks like these two lives should be counted as equal from the hedonist perspective. However, if you think about A and B's lives, it doesn't seem that they're equal. Like, if you could choose to be one, how many people would choose to be A? Probably not many. Rather, many people would choose to be person B, who ends their life living really well, rather than A, who ends their life living really, really bad, even if the sum of total pleasure over the whole of their lives is equal. And what that shows, because we prefer the life of B to the life of A, is that it isn't simply the quantity or amount of pleasure that matters to us. There are other things that also matter. In this case, that other thing has to do with kind of like the shape or trajectory that your life takes, right? Do you start out with kind of your life really bad and it ends up really good, or do you start out with your life really good and it ends up really bad, right? The fact that we prefer the life of B here to A shows that there's something wrong with hedonism that accounts only for the amount of happiness and not the kind of directionality of it. So I want you to notice something about both of these objections that I raised, and also notice how this same pattern applies to the other objections in the chapter that I'm not discussing here. The theory, hedonism, implies certain observations. So take the case of the first objection, the lobotomy objection, right? So if the kind of amount of happiness or quantity of happiness is the only thing that matters in life for living well, nothing else matters, then it seems that if we could be guaranteed to increase the kind of amount of happiness over our child's life by lobotomizing them, then that is something that we would be happy and willing to do, right? That's the observation, right? That we should be willing to lobotomize our child, and we'd be happy to do that. However, notice that we don't find that, right? We find the opposite of that, right? And so we don't find the observation that the theory implies. And so what this tends to do is to disconfirm the theory, right? There's a kind of logical structure there that logicians call modus tollens, right? So there's an if-then statement, right? If the theory is true, then it implies these observations, but we don't find those observations. And so this tends to show that theory, right, is false, right? The antecedent of the conditional is false. I want you to think about how you see that same structure in the trajectory of life objection that I just discussed, and also the other two objections in the chapter. So I want to end briefly by talking about a really interesting disagreement between two different hedonists, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both British utilitarians that we'll learn about later in the normative ethics section. But here's a disagreement. So Bentham said that pushpin is as good as poetry. Pushpin, no longer a game that's played, but think of it as a simple game like tic-tac-toe, right? If you've ever played tic-tac-toe, right, there's not much to the game, right? People get pretty bored of it pretty easily. Compare that to something like chess, or as Bentham is doing here, something like poetry, right? Which is a very complex cognitive endeavor. What Bentham is saying is that if you derive happiness from a simple game like pushpin, or you derive happiness from a complex endeavor like poetry, then as far as your well-being goes, it doesn't matter which you do. All that matters is happiness, right? In contrast, John Stuart Mill has a famous line where he says, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied." What Mill means here by a fool is a terminology we would no longer use, but what he means is someone who's severely cognitively impaired. So, for example, take my lobotomy case from earlier. Imagine, an individual whose cognitive capacities are really, really low. Right? They're not really capable of any kind of characteristically human activities, like even kind of language, like is beyond them. And so that's what he means by fool. And notice what he's saying. This is interesting for a hedonist to say. And of course, the hedonist is all about being happy and pleasure. And here Mill is saying, hey, you know what? It'd actually be better to be dissatisfied human being than a satisfied pig, right? And what he's getting at, what Mill is getting at here, and what the disagreement with Bentham is that it does actually matter what activities you're engaged in, right? As far as your well-being goes, right? Not just any activity will do. Not just any activity is the same. So whereas Bentham thinks that even simple kind of mindless things, as long as they bring you happiness, are equally good for well-being, as complex and human endeavors like poetry, or I brought the example of chess up, or any other kind of creating art, or any other complex human endeavor that kind of uses our characteristically human capacities of creativity and thought. What you're engaged in, whether they engage our kind of more cognitive capacities, doesn't matter for Bentham. For Mill, it does, and that's why Mill is saying that suppose you've got a pig that's really, really, really happy, and you've got a human that's just not happy all the time. Maybe sometimes they're happy, but not as happy as the pig is. The well-being of those two creatures is not the same for according to Mill, right? And Mill thinks, hey, no human being would be happy to be kind of turned into a pig, even if he could be guaranteed to have an even higher level of happiness than he does now. And why is that? Mill thinks it's because, one of the things that matters to us is the use of our minds, right? So we wouldn't want to have our minds taken away from us, even if it could be guaranteed that we would be happier as a result. Here's Mill in his own words. He says, "Of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all who have experienced both give a decided preference, that is the more desirable pleasure. If one of the two is, by those who are competently acquainted with both, placed so far above the other that they prefer it, even knowing it to be attended with a greater amount of discontent, and would not resign it for any quantity of the other pleasure, then we are justified in ascribing to the preferred enjoyment a superiority in quality," right? And that idea of distinguishing between quality of pleasure and quantity of pleasure really is what turns Mill into a very different kind of hedonist, arguably not really even a hedonist anymore. Because now what matters on Mill's theory is not just the amount of pleasure we derive from the activities we're engaged in, but the nature of the activity itself. So Mill distinguishes between higher and lower pleasures, right? So for Mill and for Aristotle before him, which we'll learn about in chapter 3, the more valuable pleasures, the ones that have more intrinsic value, right? Pleasures that have more intrinsic value are those that have to do with activities that utilize our intelligence, reason, and creativity, right? So Mill's version of hedonism is actually a radically different beast of a theory. It's what we'll see in chapter 3 is called the objective theory of human well-being.